Welcome to richplanet.net, the program which aims to uncover the truth behind the alien and UFO mystery. I'm Richard D. Hall, and this week's program is about UFOs. Most television programs about UFOs concentrate on sightings, which is very interesting. What is far more interesting is the UFOs themselves. In other words, how they work. In this program, I will briefly touch on some UFO sightings, but will be mainly concerned with UFO functionality. Let's start by looking briefly at some of the best photographs available. And when I say best photographs, I mean that the photographs are bona fide, genuine items. The background of the person who took each picture has been investigated, as have the pictures themselves, and there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that these pictures are fake. Clearly, when people say there is no evidence of UFOs, it is simply because they haven't looked. Let's move on to the interesting part. How do UFOs work? There are a few people in the past who have come forward with inside knowledge through their involvement with the US Black Ops programs. One of these people is Bob Lazar. In 1988 and 1989, Lazar worked for the US Navy at a secret base called S4. Lazar is a physicist and propulsion expert. His role in the program was to try and work out or back-engineer the propulsion system of a flying saucer that the US government had acquired from aliens. Other scientists, such as Tom Vallone, have also given information on how UFO craft operate. I will describe some of his claims later. Some people have tried to debunk Bob Lazar, claiming that he was planted by the government, or that he made the whole thing up to make money, or that he did not have academic qualifications. To answer these claims, I will point out a few facts about Bob Lazar. Firstly, having watched his videos in which he explains the craft's propulsion system, there is no doubt in my mind that he is educated to a high level in physics. Secondly, the claims about him making up the story. He has passed polygraphic lie detector tests, and the police officer who undertook the tests stated, if he's lying, he ought to be in Hollywood. Also, his story has not changed at all since he went public in 1989. Lazar has not really profited from this story and has moved on to work in other fields. Thirdly, in 2006, Lazar was arrested and had his house raided by the US government because he had built a particle accelerator in his back garden in order to carry out research into hydrogen-propelled vehicles. If he was planted by the government in 1989, why would he be arrested in 2006? He is clearly not on their side. And fourth, in fairly recent years, Lazar has given lengthy interviews about work he was involved with in the 1980s. And by analysing his language and phraseology 20 years later, it is clear he was telling the truth. After he describes the propulsion system of the craft, he goes on to say, the navigation and flight control side of things still puzzle me. He is genuinely still puzzled about aspects of the UFO he worked on in 1989. Without further ado, let's explain the propulsion system of the UFO proposed by Bob Lazar. It's a fairly well accepted view that at least some UFOs use a gravity or anti-gravity propulsion system, and the Lazar UFO is no exception. In order to explain anti-gravity, I'm first going to explain a little bit about conventional aircraft. First of all, what is flying? Well, rather than consider flying, let's just consider getting off the ground, because the two are not the same. There are three different ways that we Earthlings have discovered that will get us off the ground and into the sky. The first method is the hot air balloon. This method relies on the fact that the air around us is a fluid which has mass. If we create an object which is on average less dense or lighter than the air surrounding it, then it will float above the surrounding air. The hot air balloon is essentially floating on the air in the same way that a plastic duck floats in the bath. This method of getting us off the ground is not really flying, but floating. The second method is what we would consider flying. The Wright brothers achieved the first flight in 1903, and the difference between this and a balloon is that the plane is heavier than the air, whereas the balloon is not. Hence, the Wright brothers' aeroplane was not floating, but flying. Flight is achieved by the craft creating pressure underneath the wings due to the airflow above and below the wings causing lift. This is also true of a helicopter. When a bird flaps its wings, it creates the same effect. This is what we humans call flying. The third method that Earthlings have discovered is used by a space rocket or indeed by a firework. The upward thrust uses Newton's third law. By creating a force in a downward direction, an equal and opposite thrust is created in an upward direction, propelling the rocket. In this type of motion, we would not consider the craft to be flying. The first two methods discussed here would not work on the Moon or on any planet that has no atmosphere. They rely totally on there being surrounding air to work. The third method would work without air, but requires lots of heavy fuel to eject out the back of the craft in order to project it off the ground. Of the methods mankind has discovered, two don't work in space, and the third requires lots of heavy fuel. Having considered these three methods, you now need to forget them. The UFO doesn't get off the ground using any of these techniques, and it certainly doesn't fly, float, or use thrust, but it does get off the ground, and I will explain how. We need to consider why things stay on the ground in the first place. We've all heard of gravity. In everyday physics, we know that a very large object, such as the Earth, attracts all other objects and causes them to accelerate towards it. We observe this when an apple falls from a tree. This pulling force is dependent on the weight or mass of the large object. All objects on Earth are actually attracted to each other by the same gravity, but the size of the force is so small you don't notice the attraction between objects, only towards the Earth. It's only when something becomes as large as the Earth that there is a significant pull. We should now consider why a large mass pulls all other masses towards it. To best describe the effect of gravity, it's easier to consider the universe as being two-dimensional. In other words, there is no up or down. The universe is just a flat surface. Consider placing the Earth in this two-dimensional universe. It bends the space around it. This bending of space is what a gravitational field is, except it works in 3 dimensions, which is impossible to picture in our mind, so we will continue to use 2 dimensions in this example. We can now place an apple in our universe, and as expected, it falls to the Earth. Let's put the apple back. Now consider for a moment how we could prevent the apple from falling to the Earth. Well, what if we created another distortion away from the Earth, just behind the apple, like so? The apple could then balance on the rim and would essentially just stay in mid-air. And this is how the UFO stays off the ground. It generates its own gravity well away from the Earth's, such that the two are cancelling out the effect of each other. This is why, when the UFOs hover, their motion is seen to be slightly unstable, because the propulsion system has to make constant corrections to keep the two balanced, a bit like balancing on a tightrope. Note that anyone inside a craft hovering in this fashion would be weightless, so the craft stays off the ground using a method unlike any conventional aircraft. It is in effect interfering with the thing that keeps us on the ground in the first place, gravity. Imagine then if we allow the apple to start to fall into the gravity well that it has created, but as it falls, then move the position of the well further from the Earth. We could then make the apple move at incredible speed, and this is how the propulsion is achieved in an anti-gravity craft. So how on earth can these craft manipulate space in this way? How do they produce their own gravity? Well, according to Bob Lazar's explanation, the craft use a special chemical element called ununpentium, or element 115, which is found at the very end of our periodic table. A small piece of the element is used at the heart of a gravity reactor. In this reactor, the element is bombarded with protons and very briefly is turned into element 116. This element does not exist for long, but when it does, emits a gravity wave, which is then focused using 3 gravity amplifiers housed in the belly of the flying saucer, which then produces the gravity wave, causing the distortion of space to propel the craft. The reactor also produces massive quantities of energy in an antimatter type nuclear reaction that is required to achieve the distortion of space. After the break, I will explain how these craft can travel across light years of space, well in excess of the speed of light, yet still adhere to Einstein's laws of relativity.